How many of you are Polish? Let's see, how many of you are Ukrainian? Okay, I don't know what the rest of you are. That covers so let me share with you that I am utterly convinced. Oh, we got some Germans here too, right? Raise your hands. Okay, I'm so sorry. So I am utterly convinced that no matter the culture, that for some of our cultures, the meal is at the heart of our families, our gatherings, our sharing. And I got to say that during the course of this week, I'm sure that I put on about 10 pounds this week. I'm sure that. But the truth is, the meal is what brought us all together, isn't it? And as you gather with your families, so the same, I'm sure. Now, the last time we were together, I talked about a very specific meal in which I hid my Brussels sprouts. Do any of you remember that? Okay. But this time, what I want to share with you is, I want you to get the picture just for a minute. Walk in to the Greco household. This was my mother's parents' house, right? Every Sunday afternoon. I walk in, and there are the uncles watching the big game. You know, the big game, right? And then in the kitchen are all the ladies who are preparing the big meal. You know, the big meal, right? Well, and Joe gave me this beautiful reflection. I'm almost all the way through it, Joe Lucci. I got to tell you that this reflection talks about how, for we Italians anyway, that Thanksgiving wasn't just turkey and yams and whatever else. We always had to have lasagna as well, you know, right? So here's the thing, though. I want you to picture this. I walk into the kitchen. There's my grandmother, my mother, all the aunts, and my sister Susan, who is significantly older than I, and Susan's young daughter. So now you got 4 generations there, right? Watch what happens. Grandmother Greco is slicing off the 2 edges of a ham. She prepares to slide it into the oven, and my little niece says, who is actually not much younger than I at that point, says to her mother, my older sister, says, "Mommy, why does great-grandmother slice off the ends of the ham?" She said, "Honey, I'm not really sure. I think maybe it's so that the juices can flow more freely and it'll cook more evenly, and, you know, etc." And she said, "Well, let's ask." And then she goes not to her great-grandmother, but next they go to my mother. So now you got 3 generations, right? Okay? And they ask, "Mom, Grandma, why does great-grandmother slice the ends of the ham off?" She said, "Well, I'm not really sure, but she's always done it that way, and I think it's so that the juices can flow more evenly, and, you know, that the ham cooks better and more thoroughly, and but let's go ask." The 3 of them go over to my grandmother, Angela's great-grandmother, my little niece, and the question again, "Why do you do it this way?" She said, "Oh, that. When your great-grandfather and I were first married, we lived in a tiny little row home that had the littlest oven ever." She said, "And I just got accustomed to slicing off the ends of the ham so that I could fit it in the oven." You know? Why do we do what we do? How do we see with eyes of faith? How do we see with eyes of hope? How do we recognize the things in our living that are true, that really have value? I was in Groton Falls, New York, and there was a little 9-year-old girl that went to the pastor and said, "Father Jim," Catherine is her name, "Father Jim, I'd like to give a homily this weekend. Would that be okay?" 9 years old, right? Father Jim said, "Well, you know, Catherine, I'm sure that you can speak, but, you know, maybe you want to give me an idea of what you want to talk about?" And she said, "Well, I was watching the news, and I see that over the Hudson River, on the other side of the river, it's been really cold this winter, and there are people freezing to death in New York City." She said, "Oh, so I want to talk to everybody about getting blankets and long johns and clothing so that we can take it over to those freezing people." Well, I'm going to tell you something. 9 years old. This child saw a need and did something about it. This child saw, as we would say, as Jesus would, and said, how can I help? How can I do as Christ would do? So she spoke at each Mass, not the homily, but she spoke at each Mass, and she made an appeal. And the response was so huge that they ended up having 3 semi-18-wheeler trucks parked in the back of the parking lot, and they drove those 3 trucks over into the city and distributed the clothing to people in need. Now that was over 20 years ago. Do you know, folks, they still have Catherine's Drive every year. Isn't that amazing? Sometimes in our lives we wonder how we can respond. How can you or I make a difference? Sometimes we feel helpless because the need seems so much greater than we could ever possibly handle. And yet I got to tell you, when I visit St. Joseph the Provider School, and I watch Father Mike, and I watch the principal, and I watch Chris, and I watch all those kids, and I watch one at a time how the lives of each of those children, I am convinced that their lives are changed forever, for the good. Amen? Amen. There are ways in which each of us, you and I, are called to respond to that need. The last time we were together, I shared with you the story of a guy named Henry Robert. Do you remember this? You might not. Last living descendant of the guy that wrote Robert's Rule for Order. And in Annapolis, Maryland, Henry had a beautiful home and estate that he was inheriting. But when he became a Catholic, his Anglican, his Episcopalian parents disinherited him and left him only the life estate of the house. He gave the house to a charity for the homeless, and he moved into a house on the campus that was owned by Charles Carroll. Do you remember who Charles Carroll is? Anybody? Well, he's the cousin of the first bishop of the United States, John Carroll. But more importantly, he's the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. How about that? And Charles Carroll of Carrollton gave all of his property to the Redemptorist Fathers, which they still have today, which is St. Mary Parish in Annapolis, Maryland, and the house in which he lived is still there. And Henry, the guy that gave up his inheritance to become Catholic, lives on the 3rd floor of that estate. And he works every day, opening up the church, closing the church, helping with the books. He is a consecrated celibate, but not ordained. And he helps there every single day. Now, here's the thing. We discovered a secret room in that house. Do you know what the secret room is for? Well, the schematic made it very clear. There was a place where the pulpit, the ambo, went. There was a place where the altar went. There was a place where the faithful came and sat. Why in a secret room, folks? Oh, shocker. Are you ready for this? Because in the colony of Maryland, which was not named after the Mother of God, but after the consort of Lord Calvert, who settled southern Maryland. No. In that secret room, the reason it was there was it was illegal in the colony of Maryland for Catholics to have Mass in public. Amazing, huh? Here's the greatest part of all. I asked him, Henry, why'd you do it? Now, if you ever meet Henry, well, let me just forewarn you, he's a rather peculiar man. He wears a bow tie everywhere. He has a perfectly trimmed beard. But when he speaks to you, he always begins with clearing his throat, and then he talks. I said, Henry, why'd you do it? He looked at me and smiled, but then looked at me as though I had 3 heads. He cleared his throat. He said, Vince, you should know, of course, it's the Eucharist. It's the Eucharist. And then he said, folks, there is no inheritance, no treasure in this world that can rival the gift of God's presence in the Eucharist. Wow. Do we believe that? Because if we do,
how can we not be changed by what we receive? What price would we pay? How can we see with eyes of faith? How do we recognize the gift before us? How do we come here and not just get the mark of hope and the mark of our redemption and the mark of our fleeting days in the ashes that we will receive on our forehead? No, how do we actually see with clarity the precious gift entrusted to our care? Do we believe? For this is not only the presence of God, but it is healing for a broken world. Amen. I need you, Joe, please.